All right, let's get into it. So great to see you all today. And we are here to talk about the annual report that PXO Culture release. And I am very excited that we have a very special guest who I think I'll let her talk a little bit about her background and why she knows me. And then I'll talk a little bit about why I think it's great to have Tejal with us today. So over to you. Please introduce yourself, Tejal.
Hi everyone, my name's Tejal. I used to head up talent at Kantar, which is a marketing company that's private equity backed. What I'm really passionate about is driving transformation at pace, at scale, where people are at the heart of that. I've got a very squiggly career and I've worked in and with private equity. I've worked in financial services. I've been outside of HR as well as inside of HR. And I am super excited to be here with Natal, um, because I got to know her work at a time where I was repositioning my team. A mutual friend of ours introduced me to Natal's Agile L&D book, that just articulated what I was trying to do with my team in a much better way than ever could. So I've been following Natal very closely and delighted to be here.
Great. Thank you, Tejal. Okay. And I'm Natal Dank. I head up PXO Culture, which many of you will be familiar with. And I also operate as the principal consultant here. And I also write a few books. A third one is about to come out, well, early next year, once I actually write it, I suppose. But it's very exciting. So I'll talk a little bit about that today. But today we are focusing on the 2026 HR and Priorities Report. We always get great feedback from the report, and I like to think that we're seen as an alternate voice to a lot of the main consultancies out there that do their sort of range of predictions and what they think is going to happen each year. We take all of the reports that are released across different consulting firms, but also in particular sources such as the World Economic Forum. And we then sort of scan those trends and decide what we think are the key priority areas for HR and people teams. And some of them will be more obvious. Some, I think it's an interesting little plot twist. And I'll talk a little bit about why we've gone for those priorities. But first of all, let's talk about the theme of the report. And I don't know if you've noticed, but it feels a little bit uncertain out there. And we've had a few reports coming in over the next couple of days that demonstrates just how complex, disrupted, and chaotic the world can feel right now. On the screen is the World Trade Uncertainty Index. And this is an index that tracks the use of the word uncertainty, essentially, in economic reports that are released by governments into the World Economic Forum. And this index has gone since 2008. And as you can see, there's a few spikes here and there, but then we hit 2025 and it's literally off the charts. It's come down slightly, but it'll be really interesting to see what happens after what we've just had in terms of reports coming in from the Middle East. I've just got a text from someone that I was meant to meet tomorrow, and they've just got out of Dubai. So it just shows you how chaotic and uncertain the world is. And so that really shapes our theme. And I think many of you have already come across me talking about this idea of fundamental uncertainty. So fundamental uncertainty is recognizing we're now in a world where you need to continuously deal with change. And in the past, we've often talked about disruption, volatility, ambiguity as something that kind of will settle over time. Or perhaps you just need to get through this change and things will calm down and you can kind of take stock and then rebuild your resilience. And what we're saying in the world of fundamental uncertainty, it's always there. And what we need to do is actually build up mechanisms in which we can feel like we're more safe and we've got some consistent ways of working within an environment that will change consistently. And this is because it's not that you don't have the data. We often have all the data we need, but it's because the change is really hard to predict now. They were saying that actually economic forecasts in the past, you could predict fairly comfortably a year or so out. Now, economic forecasters are really reluctant to predict anything out beyond a month. And so, what we're saying is that you can have all the data, you can predict the change that happens tomorrow, but some of it will be very unexpected, like what we've just seen in the news over the last couple of days. So, that's quite fun, makes you very vulnerable, makes you think, oh God, that's quite hard to handle. What do we do? But the flip side of this is that fundamental uncertainty gives you what we're calling creative freedom or creative choice. And what it's reflecting is a lot of what Mark Carney was talking about at Davos, and also what I'm starting to see as I work with teams in organizations is that when all the rules are broken, when the old norms don't exist anymore, when there's been a rupture in expectations, assumptions, these hidden rules that we've always had about the workplace, when they are turned on their head, then you have permission to play. And actually, by leaning into uncertainty, you actually get creative choice. You can redesign the system. And I think with the introduction of AI into the workplace and lots of other elements, not only do you have to experiment to understand how to move forward and make decisions, but actually it really gives you an opportunity to do things in a new way. And I think that is incredibly exciting. And I urge you all to read one book, which is called Embracing Uncertainty by Margaret Heffernan, who really kind of captures this and talks about how artists and musicians always lean into uncertainty, and it helps them build something that's fantastic. So let's just sort of take stock there. Tejal, what's your thoughts on this idea of what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's such a fascinating idea. If I think about um, kind of, if I start big and then go smaller, the macro environment is just crazy. Like that volatility, the AI, the geopolitical instability, the supply chain fragility, inflation, regulatory, even the what's going on in the Middle East at the moment, it's just scary. And so all of that external change is happening faster than organizations can absorb. And as you say, there's no sign of stabilization. So how do we get used to that? At the same time, in organizations, there's a lot of hype on AI versus value creation. And I think boards and investors have moved, from all of that experimentation and pilots, and there's real pressure now to demonstrate that value. Um, and then when you think about people, people are leaders are just carrying this heavy emotional and cognitive load. They're struggling with these paradoxes. You've got, they need to move fast, but they need to be safe. They need to cut costs, but they need to protect the culture. They need to simplify, but they need to deliver growth. They need to automate with AI, but they need to build capability. And the list goes on. So I think it's really tough. And then you've got employees that are just super anxious and worried about AI and job security, and it's eroding trust and morale. So I think HR's role generally is really important to kind of help architect kind of how systems operate going forward. And I think that creative choice is so important because otherwise you're the victim. Everything is being done to you and people are responsive. And so actually Margaret Heffernan's kind of point around leaning into that creative choice for me is super, super important because that means we get to shape, and make choices around how the world operates in this chaotic place. And I think it just makes people, companies much more intentional about what they really want to achieve and what they really believe in.
Yeah, no, it's really great points. And I think for me, the word paradox is just so
Mm,
key. And that is complexity, that several
mhm,
things can be true at the same time. And I think a lot of society sort of struggles with that because it creates a tension that you can't sort of resolve. And therefore you need a way of making decisions. So you need some kind of criteria, don't you, to be able to move forward in that environment. The other key, yeah, the word intentional. So intentional design, intentional choices. And I think when it comes to AI, we have there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of noise, but actually the best way to embrace AI in the workplace is through that intentionality. What choices are we going to make and why? What value does it create? How does it help, people get the job done? What are we trying to achieve with our product? Rather
mhm.
than, right, let's all just use Copilot and go kind of thing. So
Exactly.
Excellent. So that's the theme. Embrace the fundamental uncertainty and lean into your creative choice, your creative freedom. And some of you might be familiar with the word anti fragility. That's one that kind of came quite popular during COVID. And it's this idea that you're able to find opportunity and growth in times of great change and complexity and uncertainty. So let's all aim for some anti fragility in 2026. Okay, fabulous. So when you signed up, we asked everyone a few questions about what are your priorities this year and what are some of the challenges that you face. So I'd like to just share back some of those insights with you before we move into the priorities, because you'll see there's a lot of there are a lot of links. And I was really happy when I saw everyone's input. I thought, yes, we've definitely landed on the right priorities. So the first one was, of course, what are your priorities or your main priority for 2026? And as you could imagine, the word AI was quite loud. But what was really interesting is that it was mostly connected to the word integration. And there was also these themes of integration, of AI integration, A integration, organizational integration. And I really thought that was very interesting because, again, it links back to this discussion around intentional design. Some of the other key themes was development and leadership, AI being both transformative as well as this idea of building the right kind of system. And then, of course, that all feeds into organizational effectiveness, which I'm finding is becoming a key theme in all the teams I'm working with. And of course, many of you are also talking about career movement, job seeking in a really tough environment, or helping people in that space. Any comments about people's priorities, Tejal? What's your thoughts there?
I think it's fascinating, and I can absolutely identify with every single one of those themes. I think I also like Mark Carney's speech, and the word that comes to mind when I look at this list is that need for organizations and people to be adaptive in a
Mhm.
world with lots of ambiguity, lots of uncertainty. And I think for me that this sort of gives that sort of permission to ask those questions around the assumptions we're making. What are the things we're going to stop doing? How do we sort of stop pretending to know that destination before you actually start? And how do you sort of stop looking for that precedent? So I think it sort of, really ties into an organization's culture and how that sort of culture supports people to navigate through this ambiguity, and bringing it back to that creativity around creating that culture of being able to think really, really big around the challenge and the opportunities out there, so that we really understand the art of the possible, and then we can reimagine, what work looks like and what those
Mhm.
outcomes are, particularly in a world of AI, particularly in terms of how you integrate that into M&A or development priorities or organizational effectiveness.
Yeah, no, it is. That's why I was so happy when I saw all this come through because excellent. Yeah, I really feel like we're highlighting the right things, but also that this is it's again there's a bit of a paradox. This is the biggest challenge
Yeah.
of how do you build, do intentional design, but also this is the biggest opportunity because you can make
Mm.
choices and you can really experiment. And I've just put in chat, I think, quote so far of the webinar, which is stop pretending we know the destination before we start. I really
Yeah.
like that one. And that is a big theme of some of the HR leadership teams I'm working with at the moment. We're looking at strategy, we're looking at building up this sort of cadence of work for the year. And you need to be really upfront that everything is essentially a hypothesis. And then you need to work to see what will be true and what won't, and then go from there, which I think it feels very vulnerable, I think, when you start thinking
Mm.
like that. But once you lean into it, you can be more data driven around your decisions, which I think is really good. Okay, and then leading into what's your biggest challenges or concerns for 2026. What I did this time was just I tried to pull out key statements from each of you that contributed, and there was sort of saw that there was two sides of the comments that we received. On the left side, which is has a white background, is the idea of the uncertainty, essentially the context of fundamental uncertainty. So things such as the desire to do everything all at once. And in particular, I believe that came from a not-for-profit charity sector. And I was just working with a team at Macmillan Cancer Research the other day, and this is such a big issue of there's so much to do, there's so much you can do. How do you make very strategic, ruthless, prioritized decisions? Then there's other things like maintaining colleague morale and momentum during this uncertainty. Again, this organizational effectiveness, but you've got to do it while everything's changing around you. I like the term of transforming while getting the basics right. So, this idea of kind of building the plane as you start to fly. And that, again, is really quite a challenge. Then, over on the right side, which has a blue background, I realize if you're colorblind, that's not as useful. But on the right side, where we've got the lady in catching the other person, we've got things such as sort of the factors that are sometimes even out of our control that are adding to this element of fundamental uncertainty. So geopolitics, of course, scaling AI. I thought the one at the bottom's really interesting: wellness, lack of enthusiasm, and breakdown of the psychological contract. And we're actually going to talk a bit about that one. And then some of the challenges. So strategic workforce planning, the transmission and preservation of critical skills. And actually, this comment also linked to a further kind of comment, which was that particularly people of older generations that are potentially leaving the workforce over the next 10 years, and how can we actually make sure all that those great skills are passed on, particularly as AI comes into the workplace. So we'll talk a bit about that. I thought really interesting themes, and these two sides, I think, which demonstrates the role of HR and people, which is how do you help your people in this time of fundamental uncertainty to be well, to be their best selves, to feel essentially safe and secure, as well as how do you build the organization in the right way. Any comments on this one, Tejal, before we move on?
I think these are brilliant, brilliant themes. I think for me, the piece around organizational effectiveness is the one that's really, really important, because actually
Mhm.
you're trying to transform as things are changing already. And I think organizations got an opportunity to almost leapfrog some of that. Uh, Maybe the last point, some of that inefficiency and kind of the way things were done in the past, to really reimagine what great looks like. And I think if organizations are intentional, you could absolutely, really drive that innovation. You are really thinking about scaling AI, strategic workforce planning, and even thinking about well-being as well. Given all the noise around this sort of cognitive atrophy as a result of using AI, given the research from Anthropic recently around AI is so good at doing everything, but it means that people are like operating at a higher level. And so that sort of cognitive kind of load is really high. So I think there's lots here for us that feed actually into your themes really neatly.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, fabulous. Well, let's get into our 5 priorities and explore each one a little bit further. And happy to say, we're also going to come back to your comment, Ian, because exactly that is part of the context at the moment. Okay, so 5 priorities, drum roll, of course, AI, co-intelligence, and strategic workforce planning. So this intentional design that we're talking about, the choices that you make for a human and machine workplace. How does that feed into the value delivery in your organization? And how does that actually help people be great in their role and essentially do that higher level work? But also, how do you start to, I suppose, challenge some of the rhetoric we have around the replaceability of people, because that feeds in very much to the second one. So as Ian Thompson put into chat, he's commented, I sense more defensive cost saving, riding out the storm, less confidence about building and cultures. And we're feeling that too. And this was interesting because each year we have talked about an issue around ethics and trust in organizations. And in the past, we've touched on things such as climate change. We've touched on things such as diversity, equity, inclusion. And we've also kind of positioned that that we're working in a much more polarized society. So there's these political tensions, there's a lot of polarized debate on social media. And that can then play out in your organization. And I mentioned I was at a charity last week and they said they deal with that quite a lot, very strong opinions, strong kind of voices that the HR team also are the key area that they have to deal with. So that's all feeding into what we're calling the need to rebuild the employment deal. And this is because it's starting to feel quite transactional. It's people are continuously getting told to do more with less. And that's causing people to feel that perhaps they're not getting as much in return for what they're giving. Number 3 is the plot twist, which is Agile HR is dead. I'll give you my views as to why we are evolving in the world of Agile HR. And that leads nicely into the next 2, which is the evolution of the product-led HR model. So it's really starting to, I think, gain ground. And we're starting to see some really nice models out there of how you can take the benefits of agility and really feed that into value delivery. And then all of that feeds into essentially what I see as the evolution of all of Agile HR and business agility, which is workplace elasticity. And that's thinking of agility at a much more systems level, ties very much into the organizational effectiveness that we're talking about, the idea of strategy being a hypothesis. So that's the 5. Let's get into the first one and we can learn more. So number 1 is AI co-intelligence and strategic workforce planning. As you can see, our quote there is that we are the custodians of the loop. And this does not mean that you're now in the matrix, though sometimes when you go onto social media, you kind of feel like you are. I saw something last night and I thought, I don't know what's real anymore. But this is about the intentional design of how you take your skills clusters and start to think about what do you build, buy, and borrow, but what do you then give over to AI, whether that's automation, argumentation, or agentic. And how does that then build a workforce environment? What is it like to have humans and machines working together? What are the skills that humans need to work effectively with an AI loop? And what we're seeing is that particularly at the moment, because of the inconsistencies of output that you get from a predictability or the probability, of AI, that it won't be the same every single time, then you need to have humans checking work along the loop. But what does this mean long term? How do you maintain the skills that are required to check the work of AI? How do we build that within our organizational environment? So, what's your thoughts on this one? I know this is a big topic for you. What do you see as important here?
Yeah, I think this one is super, super important. Look, AI adoption does not necessarily equate to productivity, and MIT have got their stat around 95% of AI pilots are failing. My own experience is that actually AI is not just a technology rollout. This is a real people transformation and it's a real redesign of how work gets done. So, to give you a very tangible example, Kantar has been on the AI journey for the last few years. We were quite an early adopter, and myself and my team were very involved in helping at an organizational level improve that AI fluency. Lots of experiments, lots of training available, and lots of great change management, quite frankly. And it enabled Kantar to become Microsoft's top 3rd Copilot adopter. People were saving between 2 and 10 hours a week, which sounds great from a productivity perspective, except when you try and translate that to an enterprise level, where you are then trying to measure that through the P&L, it becomes really hard. And so what we had to do was become very clear on the outcomes that we wanted to achieve and the problems that we wanted to solve across the organization where there were pain points. So it was being clear around, do we want to improve the client experience? Do we want to improve the consistency? Do we want to just purely cut cost? Do we want to build capability? And I think, being really clear on those outcomes is important. I think that first point around everyone is learning is absolutely key. You need that sort of what I call horizontal AI fluency across the organization, including at leader level, to really reimagine, how can we achieve those outcomes in a more effective way with sort of some of that blue sky thinking. And then I thought, and then for us, like the value came when we were solving specific problems, which is what I call vertical AI adoption. And then the strategic workforce design was absolutely key. And so, Natal, to your point, this was really around reimagining work. So what is the work to start with? What gets automated? What gets augmented and what remains innately human, and really understanding kind of from a systems perspective how all of that works together. What is the process? How many handoffs? Where do decisions get made? Where does the data come from? That's really, really important to understand the work. And then that creativity comes in around redesign and then roles. And where you've got humans providing that oversight, how does that work where you've got someone managing humans and agents? And we saw this live. How do you help managers and leaders build that new capability in assessing the kind of ethics and the risk, whether the outcomes are good outcomes or whether they're bad outcomes, performance evaluation when it's humans and agents. What are the governance loops so that humans are actually accountable? How do they audit the agents? And so this, I think, is the work where HR teams can really show up and own it and really add value to the
Mm.
business.
Definitely. I've popped a few key points in chat there. And if anyone has any particular questions or comments about this priority or any others, please let us know and I'll just bring them into the conversation. Exactly. So I think it's interesting because I feel like if we go back to some of our core tenets around agility, around designing workplace solutions, what's the
Mm,
problem to solve? What's the outcomes that you need? And I feel like when AI, first at the start got really big, you sort of saw
mm,
this flurry, and we sort of forgot some of those
yeah.
key factors or key elements that we always followed. But exactly that. And I like that term vertical AI adoption versus horizontal.
Mm,
Being very specific about what do you need to solve and why. And then you are running an experiment essentially, aren't you?
yeah.
Okay, we think we need to improve the client experience. We're going to bring AI into the loop in these ways. We're going to test that for 3 months and see what happens. And we're going to then decide what changes to make or whether it was successful or not. So I think if we again, use that experimental mindset, think about the data driven approach and the outcomes that we want to achieve. And as you said, HR plays such a key role in that because we can
Mm,
be essentially the people that help you run that experiment and be thinking of things such as what skills do people need? How do managers manage an agent versus a human? And these, hence why transformation for any kind of AI transformation and integration must be multi-skilled. It can't be just run by IT or just run by HR. It needs to be a cross-functional initiative. Excellent. Any final comments around this one before we head off? Because I know it's such a big one.
move on
Yeah.
because I've got lots to
All
say on
right,
the
let's
others
do
as
it.
well.
Okay. Okay. So number two is, well, it was really coming through in the input that we received when you registered for the event. Links back to the comment that Ian just made in the chat. And it links to the kind of, I don't know, I feel like the pressure, almost a sense of overwhelm people have when I talk with them. And I think if anyone came to the end of year webinar, I made a joke, but it was a real situation where I did an icebreaker at the end of last year with a team where we were working on strategy. And I said, "Oh, what was the highlights of 2025? What surprised you? What don't you want to, what do you want to forget or not remember?" And it went really negative really quickly, and people just felt really quite overwhelmed with what was happening. And then we talked about, well, that's how our people feel in the organization. So what are the role that we play to really kind of help them navigate that? And then if we add in the pressure that people are feeling, both from cost of living, the kind of increased inequality that's happening, not just in society, but also, I would say, with wages in organizations. So we are seeing senior leaders be paid significant sums. And then wages not really moving, at other levels of the organization. And we're hearing, we're constantly asked things like, do more with less. Let's get the return on investment with this technically kind of initiative first before we hire. So it feels like there's this constant push. Return to office also added to this. And I think when you constantly read and then see examples such as Amazon announcing that they're going to grow significantly over the next 5 years, but they're not going to hire a single person because they're going to get that through AI, that makes you feel quite replaceable, even
Mhm.
expendable. And I think that is having its toll. So this is a real issue. And what we're also seeing is that people want to trust their organization because they don't tend to trust governments and media as much anymore. So there is an opportunity here, but it really, I think, comes through culture and leadership and ethics. It's not going to come from just a policy or a new EVP, which is often where we go with these things as well. So what's your thoughts on this one? This is it's a big topic, but I think really important one to discuss.
Yeah, I think this is spot on. In the past, loyalty was really important, and that was built on that sort of implied continuity. You give us commitment, we'll look after you, we'll give you that security as an employer. But that world has just changed so much in the last 5 to 10 years. And I just don't think that holds true. I looked up some data points actually because the Idleman Trust issued a
Mm.
report just recently, and trust in leadership is at a 10-year low at the
Oh, wow.
moment.
Okay.
Gallup just released a survey to say only 23% of employees are engaged. That's, 77% of employees are disengaged. So I think you have got in organizations this like really difficult situation. And I think, absolutely we need a new employment deal, but I think it needs to be adult to adult. And by that, I mean, organizations are really struggling with the change narrative at the moment. On one hand, they want to balance that sort of realism and almost that mild peril of AI is here to stay. We have to think about it to improve our competitiveness. But at the same time, you're dealing with humans and people in organizations who really care about the what's in it for me as an employee. And there's lots of fear and anxiety. And I think, the better organizations that I'm seeing navigate this are really bringing that agency back to those individuals and saying, look, we need to find a happy balance between that realism and, giving you the right kind of tools, opportunities and reskilling to move yourself up the value curve. And that involves people needing to take ownership and
Mhm.
agency around how can AI help me to be 5x or 10x in terms of the role I did? How can I use AI to do the mundane parts of the work so that I can spend more time with the client? And I think organizations need to get really clear around the actual deal that they're offering. Those
Mhm.
vague sort of purpose statements ring really hollow when people can see the trade offs being made. Amazon firing tons of people because of AI and putting that message out there around growing without adding headcount. And Mark Carney talked about this purpose wash. And I think that
Mhm.
exactly applies here. So,
Mhm.
I think what organizations need to do is talk about what work will look like and what you are asking of your people and what you're offering in return. But organizations also need to be clear around the things that they're not yet sure about. And for
Yep.
me, culture is such a big factor here. The gap between what organizations say about their culture in their glossy annual report and what people experience day to day has never been wider. And that's why I think, those data points around that low level of trust, that disengagement is so important. And I think managers have got a really important role to play in building that culture on a kind of ground up perspective. How do they properly help their teams translate strategy into their day to day priorities? What kind of psychological safety are they building in their teams? And by that, I mean that sort of coaching culture. AI is all around that experimentation. So, that manager's role on helping their teams think about creating the space to experiment, but what worked well, what didn't, what did you learn? How do they help teams fail fast? All of that stuff is really, really important. And that is manager and leader capability that is going to drive the nuance of that cultural change. And then I think you mentioned it. When we're talking about employee deals, quite often you bring out your employee value proposition team and they rewrite, something glossy. It can't be that. It can't just be a comms exercise. It has to be embedded into organization's culture, and I see it very much as an operating system. How does the company operate? What do they prioritize? How are decisions made? How are trade-offs handled? How open is it to disagree and propose new ideas? I think all of this is really important. So for me, I think there needs to be sort of this adult to adult promise in this employment deal. And I think it has everything to do with how well you embed it into your culture.
Yeah. No, great points. And Jen Stoneman has put into chat, we talk about adult to adult communication quite a lot, really trying to be clear on the what and why. And I think that
Mhm.
is so essential, that call out, that because I feel like in the past we've also talked about the EVP needs to be more than just a comms exercise. But perhaps what we're saying here is, and therefore how to go about it is what you then started to touch on, which is this intentional design of your operating system. This is how you show up in meetings. It's how you make
Mhm.
decisions. It's the
Mhm.
choices you make in strategy. It's
Mhm.
not, necessarily value slogans. It's,
No. Or
yes, it's
posters, which is
or
my other one.
posters, and actually it's the day-to-day conversations, and so it's much smaller than people kind of think it is. I think to begin with they always think that culture is this big thing and you do a big
Yeah.
transformation around it, but
Yeah.
you actually start really small. So we've got a comment of, this is a huge challenge, even good companies struggling when market changes require rapid changes of direction, redundancies, etc. And I think that's the dilemma or the paradox here,
Mhm.
is that you're trying to build this in an environment of fundamental uncertainty. And it's really
Mm.
quite, challenging.
Mm.
Right, let's keep moving. So, number three is plot twist, Agile HR is dead. And you might think, what the hell? You wrote a book on this and you're saying that it's no longer valid? Well, what I'm arguing is that we really need to see essentially the 2.0 version of Agile HR and in many ways business agility itself, really to shift and evolve into this fundamental uncertainty contextual environment that we're now in. And what I also have seen is that time and time again, teams went wrong when they brought agile HR into their operating model. And some of the themes that I kind of come across is that there was people went heavy on the framework, heavy on the rituals and the meetings, heavy on the need for speed, and thought less about that it's about having a flow of work, thinking about the toolkit that you're building. It's not just one particular framework, and how do you build a sustainable model over time. So there's a lot of themes here around how do we be much more systems thinking in our approach. And in many ways, it links a lot to thinking about the product value that you're delivering rather than just the customer need. And I think that might sound like a contradiction, but actually product value is about solving a problem for your customer, and understanding how to then track that. And that is a very different way to go about your projects, your solutions design, and the way that you work as a team. All right. So, as someone that's led a team to take on Agile HR and Agile L&D, what's your comments on that Agile HR is dead?
I think you're being too hard on yourself. And I think rather than it went wrong, it's an evolution. Let me explain. So within my team at Kantar, I brought in this philosophy of talent to value, which was really around understanding where are the value accretive parts of the organization and how do we, from a people transformation perspective, really enable that, in a turbocharged way. Some of the philosophies, within my sort of talent and L&D team were really around how do we become less order takers and more kind of connectors and strategically enable the organization to achieve its priorities through some of the the talent products that we had. And so let me give you an example. So we did run as an agile team and we had teams applying those agile rituals, for example, to deliver an AI learning academy, let's just say. Um, and, the rituals work brilliantly, exactly for the speed, for getting things done, for getting the right people into the frame. I think the piece that was missing was understanding that changing context, but also how things were connected. So one was, if you think about you had a team delivering the AI upskilling academy, but what they needed to be plugged into and connected into was our skills framework. And how do we ensure that sort of systems thinking to ensure AI fluency fits within our skill framework? But what are the other enablers in there around kind of curiosity and experimentation, and that ties to the culture? Um, how does that then connect into what we expect of our leaders and managers? And how do then managers set goals and assess performance for their team members in this world that is changing really fast, but is kind of AI led? And then, as you bringing AI into your organization, how are we then working with the business to reimagine that operating model redesign? And it is the nuts and bolts, which I keep talking about, the decision rights, the governance, the risk management, all of that, and really understanding that. And so for me, I think it's an evolution of the agile HR model rather than it's completely dead. And it just needs to be that much more adaptive to help teams understand kind of the changing context around them and how do they connect the dots between different work streams so that you're thinking much more in terms of a system rather than silos of work that needs to be delivered.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that's key. And in some ways, I might actually just shift straight into the next priority because
Yeah.
this is why I thought it was really important to then talk about the next two, which for
Mm,
me is this evolution in many ways. And two key points that you made, which is it's not just about the ceremonies, the
the
specific sprint
rituals.
itself. Yeah,
Mm.
it's about the flow. It's about how things connect. And I think probably even more so when it comes to the function of HR and people, because we don't just do one product, we don't just do one project. And we're often around whole organizational change, long term behavior change. So the interconnection of projects, work streams, dependencies are so key. So that for me, there's two key shifts that you're already seeing across HR teams that I wanted. One I'm sort of returning to, which is the product led. I've talked about this over the last couple of years. But and then this idea of how do we make much more of a systems view of agility, which is ultimately the workplace elasticity. And so product-led HR, there's a lot of talk out there about this. Interestingly, I was working at an organization just a couple of weeks ago and they were bringing in what I know is a very large scaled agile model, but they were calling it product led. So that's just how much that we're seeing a shift. And you'll see a lot of large agile certification bodies out there now talking about things like Kanban and product being the name of their certificate. You're seeing a Scrum Alliance join, do a collaboration with the product management organization. So you're seeing this sort of alignment of the two. And that's because product led helps you lift up, I think, from the framework and start to think about why are you doing what you're doing. And it's about that. If you think about the employee experience as your product, then you see it as a holistic product that you're delivering out across the organization, made up of different components, some working well, some that needs to be maintained, some that you need to innovate, some that you need to remove. But the whole thing about a product is that you deliver value by solving a shared problem or identifying the job to be done. And when we do that, we become much more about outcomes. We understand what we're trying to achieve. It also means we need to think about our operating model to achieve that. And generally, the more topic siloed approach of HR really starts to fall down. On the screen, this is a picture of the org chart of a team at TomTom, and they call themselves real time HR, the idea that they deliver solutions real time. And as you can see, their strategy, business partners, their people products, multi skilled, agile area delivering solutions, people services, and essentials. So, working product led is not just about kind of how you design a solution, it's actually the operating model that you need to put
Mm.
behind it. What's your thoughts on this one?
I love product led HR. For me, HR teams are just under scrutiny now around the value that they bring. I think us being able to move from kind of activity to outcomes
Mhm.
as a function is really, really important. So to give you a very quick example, when I was at Kantar, we launched our Growing Exceptional Manager program. in the past, we'd had kind of lots of modules on different kind of areas. And there was a real focus around monitoring the number of completions and things like that, and I call those kind of vanity sort of activity metrics. What we did differently this time around was to really think around the outcomes we wanted to achieve. And what we were seeing in the organization was we launched a new purpose. There was a ton of transformation going on everywhere, and managers were that sort of frozen middle who were the real catalyst to bring this transformation to life. And so for us, it was all around lifting that manager capability. And we were really clear that we could measure that through our manager index in our engagement survey. We used inputs like some of those data points from the engagement survey, but we also used feedback from what leaders needed, the kind of transformation and what success would look like. Co-created with our managers, and we iterated as we went along, because our main focus here was the problem that we're trying to solve is to build manager capability and build manager confidence to deal with driving change. And so as we iterated as we went along, we sort of moved on this kind of journey from setting out really clearly what the expectations were from managers, starting with some sort of e-learning to help them from a development perspective, but then with their input added in peer-to-peer sessions, more adaptive scenarios, more kind of conversations around real-time challenges that were grounded in Kantar's strategic priorities, so people could really touch and feel what those priorities were, what the purpose was, what the values were. And I think kind of the biggest shift came from thinking about a manager program less as just a single program, but more as an enabler of that organizational readiness, better managers, better
Mhm.
change leadership, more kind of technical fluency, and being really clear around you're shaping the conditions for that psychological and safety and experimentation, which are exactly enablers of that organizational readiness. And I think one of the things we learned was that when we are thinking of things more in a product led perspective, you need new capabilities in your team. And we had a bit of a bumpy ride building them as we went along. Things like the business and kind of commercial acumen is really important. Those performance consulting skills, being comfortable with data and analytics and being insight led, those change skills around even the narrative on what you are solving for in the words that employees are going to see, rather than just rolling out another program and waiting for people to come. And what this enabled us to do was build much more of a kind of um, pull dynamic and people being interested in the product because it was solving something important for those individuals, rather than us constantly pushing some of this stuff out to the organization. And the last point I'd say is that one of the other things Mark Carney said at Davos was, if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. And I
Mhm.
think that
Yeah.
exactly captures where HR is right now. So, it's something around HR needs to kind of step into that sort of being relevant and being shaped around by the forces around us. And so I think thinking about things from a product lens is really, really important.
Yeah, no, excellent. I love that. If you're not on the table, you're on the menu. Maybe second quote of the webinar there, and exactly that. So that kind of feeds into the final priority, which we're calling workplace elasticity. It's actually the focus that I'm taking in the new book, and what I'm seeing is that this is the evolution of a much more systems-based approach to agility across the workplace. And there's some key themes, and it really is about prioritization and visualization of flow, not just work, backlogs and kind of increments, but the overriding flow. It's feeding in things like strategy is the hypothesis, experiment to make decisions, and what I'm calling this building of a togetherness. And that
Mm.
togetherness could be a vision, it could be the product you're designing together, it could be that you just like working with each other and you create a really nice space. Or it could be that your company is building a great product that's going to save the world with climate or green energy, something like this. So there'll be different reasons, but the idea is you're trying to feed into that. And then the image in the middle is the main way that I help HR teams at the moment build up what I call this flow. So, what are we going after and why? How do we then, on a monthly basis, think about the adapt and the plan that we're going forward to make that happen? What's changed? What do we need to do differently? What value are we actually realizing? And then back up to that kind of quarterly intake of, well, does our hypothesis of a strategy still hold true, or are things shifting? So it's again, you can see where it all comes from in terms of agile HR, but it's really kind of trying to now build this out to not just be across your function, but understand how you build flow across an organization. Fabulous. All right. So I am going to just say a few things, and then I'll ask for some final comments because we are heading into the final few minutes. But keep an eye out because the 2026 report is coming your way. Everyone will receive an email to let you know that the download is available. And in true agile fashion, I'm not going to give you the exact date just yet because that's a hypothesis as to when it will be ready. And someone's smiling that's going to help me make that happen. That's on the webinar today. But fundamental uncertainty equals creative freedom. And that I feel is your hope for 2026. Lean into that and really take agency, which was a key word that we've heard in this webinar today. And then if you're not on the PXO newsletter, please sign up by using the QR code on your screen. We specialize and focus in intelligent workplace transformation. And if you want to have a chat about what that means for you, please get in touch. Okay, thank you so much for joining us. And what final comments would you like to leave the audience with today?
I think for me, elasticity, workplace elasticity is absolutely key. This concept of things can stretch and deform under pressure, but they don't need to snap back to their original shape is really, really important. And I think a big part of that is working out what are you going to stop doing? What are you going to subtract? And how do you treat this more as a systems issue rather than kind of a personal resilience problem that you can't cope with all of this change? So, I think Natal's point around a system and iterating your hypothesis as you go along is super, super key. And I think it comes down to that culture that you build in your organization with some of these processes and steps as you go along. I think is really, really
Yeah.
important.
No, definitely. And the elasticity comes from this idea that you
Mm,
bend and stretch, but you keep coming back together again.
mm.
So, how do you build that glue, that gel in your team so you can have agency and sort of build your organization with intentional design? Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And we've got some lovely comments, super interesting and engaging. Thanks so much. Great to see you both. Great session, lots to think about, and fascinating as always. And there was a shout out, do we get the slides as well as the report? So this is being recorded and we will release that shortly. And the report will have key kind of elements of the slides as well. So, yes. All right. Have a great day, everybody.